right, let's jump into this deep dive. We're looking at a recent speech by a Chinese ambassador.
Okay.
And I think this is going to be really interesting. It touches on some pretty,
Yeah,
hot button issues globally.
definitely.
You're talking trade wars, the role of like global institutions, the UN, even the future of AI.
It's all in there.
I mean, this is great source material you've given me. So,
Yeah.
um, and I think this is really timely, especially with what's going on in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think what's so interesting about this speech is it goes beyond just like stating China's position, right? It really
Yeah.
tries to lay out a vision for the future
Yeah.
of global order. And it even offers some concrete solutions, or at least from their perspective, and using the UN's 80th anniversary as a platform to really make these points.
Right. Right.
It's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, and one of the first things that really stood out to me was just how strongly the ambassador came out against those increased U.S. tariffs.
Yes.
I mean, they call it a blatant violation of World Trade Organization rules.
Yeah, they don't mince words, do they?
No, they don't. But it goes beyond just the legal argument.
That's right.
Yeah. They really are saying this is a lose-lose situation for everybody.
Yeah, they actually use the phrase, trade wars have no winners.
Yeah.
And they bring up, very specific examples, like, for instance, the soybean trade.
Right.
American farm, they lost a major market when China imposed retaliatory tariffs, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, on the flip side, you have Chinese consumers who are suddenly facing higher prices for really, really essential goods.
Yeah.
So it really shows you how interconnected the global economy really is.
Yeah, and it seems like they're using that specific example to kind of highlight, this broader point about the danger of unilateral action.
Yeah.
and the need for more of like a multilateral approach, especially when we're talking about international trade.
Totally. It's this idea that, history shows us over and over again that going it alone really leads to instability
Yeah.
and conflict. What we need is a more cooperative approach where countries are working together to try to solve these common problems. And this is where China's Belt and Road Initiative kind of comes into play.
Right.
They present it as a prime example of this multilateral approach in action.
Yeah.
It's a platform for economic cooperation that, at least in theory, benefits everyone involved.
Right. Although, I mean, there has been some pushback, especially from the U.S. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
They see it as China trying to increase their global influence.
Yeah, and I think this is where we really see that clash of narratives that
Right.
often plays out in international relations. The U.S. sees this as a potential threat. China frames it as purely economic development and connectivity.
Well,
And it's important to remember that these are just two perspectives on a very, very complex issue.
So basically the ambassador is saying, like, let's move away from this world that's dominated by one superpower.
Yeah.
And let's move towards more of like a multipolar system where power is more evenly distributed.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a shift from a unipolar world to a multipolar world.
Okay, and then that kind of leads into, the next key theme in the speech, which is global governance reform.
Yes.
And specifically, they're calling for a reassessment of the UN Security Council.
Right.
Because, they're suggesting that the current structure doesn't really represent the realities of the 21st century.
And to really understand what they're getting at here, you have to remember, right, that the UN Security Council, in its current form, gives a disproportionate amount of power to those 5 permanent members: the U.S., Russia, China, France, and the U.K.
Right.
And what the ambassador is suggesting is that this system, it was designed in the aftermath of World War II,
Yeah.
may not actually be serving the interests of all countries,
Right.
especially those in the developing world.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like a new argument, right?
No, not at all.
We've seen this kind of growing dissatisfaction with the current global governance system for years now.
For years.
And many countries are saying it's outdated.
Yeah.
It doesn't reflect the distribution of power in the world anymore.
Absolutely. And it ties back into, to the ambassador's earlier points about multilateralism and the dangers of unilateral action.
Right.
They're basically saying that we need a more inclusive and equitable system if we're going to address these challenges of the 21st century.
Okay. So you mentioned the ambassador kind of expressed concern about potential divisions
Yes.
among the members of the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
What were they getting at there?
Well, they specifically talk about the potential for disagreement and lack of consensus
Yeah.
within the Security Council, particularly on issues related to international peace and security. And they really emphasize the need for collective security,
Okay.
where countries are working together to address these threats rather than just pursuing their own narrow interests.
And it seems like they're connecting that back to, to that idea of multilateralism.
Okay, yeah.
Which seems to be like this.
It's a theme.
Yeah, this theme that's running through the whole thing.
It's a recurring theme, yeah.
Yeah, like if the Security Council is fragmented and divided, then that undermines the whole foundation of global cooperation.
Yeah.
And makes it way harder to address these global challenges.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
so to illustrate that point, they bring up the accusations about China's influence over the Panama Canal. And they very strongly deny those accusations.
Yes, they're very forceful about that.
Yeah.
They say they fully respect Panama's sovereignty and that these accusations are basically part of a larger effort to kind of misrepresent.
Paint them in a bad light.
Yeah, paint them in a negative light. And they argue that projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, which they bring up again here,
Right.
are all about economic cooperation, not some kind of hidden political agenda.
Right.
So it really raises an interesting question for us,
Yeah.
How do we separate fact from fiction
Right.
when we're trying to understand China's role in the world?
Yeah.
You have to be aware of the different narratives that are circulating.
Right.
And really critically evaluate the information that you're seeing.
It's easy to fall into that trap of,
Absolutely.
just viewing everything through the lens of our own biases.
Yeah.
Which everyone has, whether they're, pro-China or anti-China.
For sure.
We need to have a more nuanced and informed understanding of China's actions and their intentions.
And I think the ambassador's speech really gives us a good opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
To step outside of our comfort zones a little bit and really engage with a different perspective on the world.
So the ambassador didn't just talk about like those traditional security concerns. They also talked about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And the need for the U.S. and China to work together in this space. So what were some of the key arguments there?
Well, they argue that technological restrictions are actually counterproductive.
Okay.
And that cooperation would actually benefit both countries and the world as a whole. It's this idea that a technological Cold War would really be detrimental to everyone involved.
So despite all the tension and all the disagreements, they're saying that there are still these areas where the U.S. and China can work together
For sure.
for mutual benefit.
Yeah, and they frame this potential for cooperation as being crucial for addressing those big global challenges.
Right.
Like climate change, pandemics, even, the development of these emerging technologies like AI. They seem to be saying that the U.S. and China, despite their differences, they have this shared responsibility to try to work together to solve these really pressing issues.
So it's not all like doom and gloom.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think, the ambassador's speech, while definitely highlighting the challenges and the tensions, I think it does offer a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
They seem to be saying that even in a world that's marked by all this competition and this rivalry, there's still a space for cooperation and dialogue.
And this is where I think that call for a multipolar world gets really interesting.
Yes.
Because it's not just about shifting the balance of power. It's about changing the way that countries interact with each other.
Totally. They seem to envision a world where countries can work together to address these common challenges, even if they have different ideologies and interests. It's a pretty ambitious vision.
Yeah.
And it's gonna be very challenging.
Right.
But I think it's worth exploring further.
Yeah. And that kind of brings us to the heart of this deep dive.
Okay.
What does a multipolar world actually look like in practice?
Yeah.
What role does China see itself playing in this new order? And what are the implications for the U.S. and for the rest of the world?
Big questions.
Big questions.
Yeah.
So we'll dive into those right after this.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've kind of established that the ambassador is advocating for this multipolar world. But what does that actually mean? Like, what does that mean for me, for the average person?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in a multipolar world, power isn't concentrated in the hands of just like one or two superpowers. It's distributed more evenly, right?
Yeah.
Among different countries and different blocks.
Okay.
Think of it like a round table, right? Where multiple players have a voice and they have influence.
Yeah.
No single nation kind of dictates the terms of global engagement.
Right.
And this impacts everything, from trade to security to even cultural exchange.
So if the U.S. isn't calling the shots, then where does that leave China?
Right.
Are they trying to become like the new superpower?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think it's really important to listen to what the ambassador is saying very carefully here.
Okay.
They seem to be suggesting that China sees itself as a major player in this multipolar system, but not necessarily the dominant one.
Right.
They're pushing for a system where power is shared, not just simply transferred from one hand to another.
So kind of like a first among equals type of thing.
Yeah, that's one way to interpret it, I suppose. They want to be seen as a leader,
okay,
but one that works collaboratively with other nations, especially those in the developing world.
And that's where this emphasis on reforming global institutions comes in.
Exactly.
The UN Security Council.
Right. They want a system that gives more voice to countries that have historically been marginalized, and they really take aim at the destruction of the UN Security Council, right?
Right.
Arguing that the current system is just outdated. It doesn't reflect the realities of the 21st century.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that the current structure with those 5 permanent members who have veto power, that's a product of the post-World War II era.
Exactly, yeah.
And the world has changed a lot since then.
It has.
And China, along with a lot of other countries, are saying that the way we govern global affairs needs to change too.
Absolutely.
It's interesting, though, because on the one hand, they're pushing back against what they perceive as U.S. dominance.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, they're also emphasizing this need for cooperation between the two countries, especially when it comes to things like AI.
You're right.
So it seems like they're trying to do this balancing act.
Yeah, it's a very complex relationship. The U.S.-China relationship, one of the most complex and consequential in the world today.
Right.
It's characterized by competition, by cooperation, by deep-seated mistrust.
Right.
It's going to take a lot of effort from both sides to really manage this effectively.
Yeah, and that leads to the question, like, can these two giants actually cooperate?
Right. That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen this increasing friction, right? Over trade, over technology, over security.
Right.
There's a lot of talk about a new Cold War brewing between the two countries.
Right.
But it's important to remember that it's not a zero-sum game.
Okay.
Right. There are areas where their interests align, and working together could actually benefit both of them and the world as a whole.
So it sounds like the ambassador is really urging both sides to kind of look beyond those immediate points of friction and focus on the bigger picture.
Yeah, look at the long game.
Yeah.
They're saying that when it comes to things like climate change or pandemic preparedness, even AI development, cooperation isn't just possible, it's essential.
So they're saying, like, these are global challenges that need global solutions.
Exactly.
And no one country can tackle these alone.
Yeah, right. They're suggesting that the U.S. and China, despite all their differences, have this shared responsibility to work together to try to solve these pressing issues.
So they're acknowledging that it's complicated.
Oh, absolutely.
And there are challenges, but they're still hopeful for cooperation in certain areas.
Yeah, I think it's important to avoid these overly simplistic narratives.
Right.
Whether they paint the relationship as purely adversarial or overly cooperative.
Right.
The reality is much more nuanced and it's very fluid.
And this is where that multipolar world idea gets really interesting, right?
Yes.
It's not just about shifting power.
Right.
It's about changing how countries
How they interact
with each other.
Yeah, in a multipolar world, countries are less likely to be forced to choose sides, right?
Okay.
They have more options, they have more leverage, they have more freedom to kind of pursue their own interests.
Okay.
And this can lead to a more dynamic and unpredictable international system.
Right.
But it also creates opportunities for new partnerships and new alliances.
So it's a much more fluid and complex system
Way more complex
than that old bipolar world of the Cold War.
Absolutely.
Where it was just the US and the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's a whole different ballgame.
Right.
And that makes it both more challenging and more interesting to try to navigate.
Yeah, there's no simple playbook for how to operate in a multipolar world.
No, you got to be on your toes.
Right, right.
And this is where I think the ambassador's call for reassessing global governance comes in, right? They're basically suggesting that we need new institutions and new mechanisms to manage this much more complex and interconnected world.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that they're calling for greater inclusion of countries from the global south.
Yes.
In the decision-making process.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the Global South is a term that's used to describe countries in Latin America, Asia, Africa, Oceania.
Okay.
That are often seen as being on the periphery of global power structures.
Right.
They're typically characterized by lower levels of economic development and less influence on the international stage.
So the ambassador is basically arguing that these countries need to have like a bigger say in how the world is run.
Exactly. Yeah. They're suggesting that the current system, which is dominated by a handful of powerful countries, is unfair.
Right.
And it's unsustainable. They're arguing for a more equitable system, one that gives a voice to all countries, regardless of their size or their economic power.
And how realistic is that?
Well, that's the big question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of resistance to change, especially from those who benefit from the current system.
Right.
But there's also this growing recognition that the status quo just isn't sustainable.
Right.
The world is changing, and the way we govern it needs to change too.
So it's like this battle of ideas.
It is.
Between clinging to the old and pushing for something new.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it sounds like China is trying to position itself as a champion of this new order.
Yeah, this multipolar world where power is more evenly distributed and where countries from the global south have a greater say.
Right. And of course, some people view China's rise with suspicion.
Absolutely, yeah. They see it as a threat to the existing order.
Right, but the ambassador is framing it as an opportunity.
Right, as a chance to create a more just and equitable world.
It's a compelling vision.
It is.
But it remains to be seen whether it can actually happen in practice.
We'll see.
Yeah, the coming years will be crucial.
Absolutely.
In determining which direction things go.
Yeah, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, right? I mean, we're not just talking about these abstract concepts.
Right.
We're talking about the forces that are actually shaping our world, the choices that are going to determine our future.
It's a good reminder that we're all a part of this.
We are.
Yeah, and we all have a stake in the outcome.
Absolutely.
But we still have to unpack that final point from the ambassador,
right?
Their perspective on U.S.-China relations and the potential for cooperation.
Okay.
So we'll dive into that right after this.
All right. So we've talked about this multipolar world and global governance reform, but where does the U.S. actually fit into all of this? I mean, the ambassador seems to be sending some mixed signals.
Yeah.
They're criticizing U.S. unilateralism.
But then also calling for greater cooperation, especially in areas like AI. How do we make sense of that?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a contradiction. I mean, international relations are rarely black and white.
Right.
They're acknowledging that there's competition between the U.S. and China, but they're also suggesting that competition doesn't have to preclude cooperation, especially when it comes to these shared challenges.
So they're basically saying, like, even rivals can find common ground.
Exactly. Yeah. Take AI, for example.
Okay.
This is an area where both the U.S. and China are investing a lot of resources and where they both see huge potential, but also potential risks.
Right.
And the ambassador is essentially saying that it's in both of their interests to work together to ensure that AI is developed responsibly and ethically.
So instead of an arms race, it's more like let's work together and
Yeah, more collaborative.
share knowledge and set some standards and mitigate these risks.
Exactly, yeah. And it goes back to those earlier points, right? About the dangers of unilateral action and the need for multilateralism.
Yeah.
They're saying that going it alone on AI is not only unwise, it could be really dangerous.
But I mean, some people would say that this whole idea of cooperation is kind of naive, given, how much mistrust there is between the U.S. and China.
Of course, yeah. There are going to be skeptics. But, cooperation isn't about ignoring your differences or pretending that everything's,
right,
perfect.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that even in a competitive relationship,
Yeah.
there are areas where working together is really the only logical and responsible way forward.
So it's like compartmentalizing it, right?
Yeah.
Separating those areas where competition is just inevitable
Yeah.
from those areas where collaboration is essential.
Absolutely.
And that's where diplomacy comes in.
Yeah, exactly. It's about finding ways to communicate, to build trust, to identify those areas where your interests overlap, and then to develop those mechanisms for actually working together effectively.
It sounds like a very delicate balancing act.
It is. It is. And it's going to require a lot of effort, a lot of goodwill from both sides, but the stakes are high.
Yeah.
We can't just give up on cooperation.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
what are the big takeaways for you? What should our listeners be thinking about as they try to make sense of this really complex and rapidly changing world?
Well, I think the ambassador's speech gives us a lot to think about, right?
Yeah.
It really highlights this idea that we're in a period of transition, moving away from that unipolar world dominated by the U.S. to a more multipolar system where power is more evenly distributed. And it also underscores this need to really rethink global governance.
Yeah.
Update those institutions like the UN Security Council to reflect the realities of the 21st century. And then finally, it suggests that despite all of the competition between U.S. and China, there's still that potential for cooperation, especially when it comes to those global challenges.
Right. Climate change, AI, pandemics.
Exactly.
So the ambassador argues that international relations are at a crossroads. So given what we've learned in this deep dive, what direction do you think the world should take? And what role should China play in all of this?
It's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And there are no easy answers, but it's definitely a question worth pondering, right?
Yeah.
as we try to navigate this uncharted territory.
Absolutely. Well, hey, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.